The battle line didn't have a shape anymore. It had started that way, two fleets holding formation coalition ships spread across a corridor of dead space between them and the Viltrumite advance. Clean geometry. The kind of engagement a commander could read at a glance. Then the first wave hit, and the geometry became a cloud of wreckage and bodies moving in opposite directions at several hundred kilometers per second. Mark had been in the middle of it for 40 minutes. He knew because his lungs kept count every held breath. While vacuum pressed against his suit, every gasp when he punched through a hull fragment large enough to block his path. 40 minutes of this felt like 4 hours. His knuckles had stopped hurting somewhere around minute 25, which he took as a bad sign. Ahead of him, a Viltrumite in a gray bodysuit. The emblem on her chest cracked and smeared with someone else's blood, grabbed a coalition soldier by the arm, and simply rotated. The soldier's trajectory changed dramatically. Mark didn't watch the rest. He accelerated. She saw him coming. Viltrumites always did. They had the same gift he had, that instinctive awareness of speed, of mass, of where the next impact was going to originate. She turned to meet him with both hands raised, expression flat, methodical. A veteran. The kind who didn't telegraph anything. Mark hit her anyway. The collision was mutual and ugly. They grappled at close range, exchanging short, vicious strikes. No room for technique at this velocity, just elbows and foreheads and the grinding pressure of two bodies made for this, trying to end each other. She headbutted him hard enough to snap his head back. His vision blurred. He grabbed her wrist before she could rotate him the same way she'd handled the coalition soldier, and he threw. Not elegantly. Just aimed her at empty space and let go, buying himself 2 seconds to breathe. A Viltrumite male hit him from the right. Not 2 seconds, 0 seconds. They spun together through a debris field, shattered bulkhead panels, the frozen arc of venting atmosphere, something that might have been a person once. Mark wrestled his arm free, planted a foot against his attacker's chest, and pushed off hard enough to send them both tumbling in opposite directions. His father's voice from training that felt like another life. Don't fight gravity. Use it. Use everything. Right, everything. 40 kilometers away, Nolan Grayson hit a Viltrumite fighter hard enough to drive him backward through the hull of a coalition frigate. The ship groaned. He didn't stop. He followed the fighter through the breach, through 2 interior compartments, and out the other side, then reversed trajectory and came back in the same hole. Controlled damage. That was what he called it now. After years of pretending that was what Omni-Man had always been, controlled. Precise. Professional. He almost believed it. The frigate's crew had time to evacuate the damaged sections. He'd made sure of that, a half-second assessment, when he first identified the hull as a coalition vessel. He had that calculation down to reflex now. Coalition preserve. Viltrumite end. Simple. Clean. A system that worked. He drove the fighter into the frigate's remaining superstructure and pulled back. The Viltrumite hit the wall at a bad angle and didn't get up immediately. Nolan gave him 3 seconds, then moved on. There were 9 more priority targets he'd clocked in the last sweep, and the battle's center of gravity was shifting north of his current position. He flew toward the next contact point at full speed and then felt something wrong. Not a hit. Not an incoming strike. Something else. A sensation he hadn't experienced since a very different kind of crisis years before all of this. A pressure against the fabric of local space-time, like a finger pushed through wet paper. Nolan stopped moving. A tear opened in the vacuum ahead of him. Not a ship. Not a portal of any coalition technology he recognized, and not Angstrom Levy's work either, which had a specific signature Nolan had learned to read the hard way. this was something rawer than either. The edges of it caught the light from the distant star wrong, refracted, doubled, as if reality couldn't agree on what the geometry should be. Something fell through it. He was male, wearing a suit with the aesthetics of a Kryptonian symbol. The sigil, clear even at distance, worked into chest armor that caught ambient light like polished gunmetal, the whole assembly built around a frame that was meant to contain something rather than protect it. Black hair, young, visibly young, in the way that meant nothing about what was underneath. He hit vacuum, and his body absorbed it instantly. No pressure suit adjustment, no reaction to the temperature. His eyes swept the battle around him with an expression Nolan had seen before. Not confusion, assessment. The kind of assessment that came from someone already deciding what everything around him meant. Nolan had worn that expression himself once. It hadn't meant anything good. The war was loud in ways that had nothing to do with sound. In vacuum, the noise of it was entirely transmitted vibration through hull contacts. The bone-conducted thud of shockwave when something large enough detonated nearby. Mark registered it as pressure against his chest. His jaw, the soles of his feet, even through open space. He'd gotten better at reading that language. Which direction? How big? How close? What he could not read, and had never developed an instinct for, was the pulse of wrongness that rolled through his body when the tear opened 30 meters to his left. He turned. The figure who came through moved like someone who had never needed to account for other people's presence. Not hostile, not cautious, simply indifferent, the way a planet was indifferent to anything happening on its surface. He was already orienting himself, already scanning. Mark watched him take in the Viltrumite assault formation bearing down from the north quadrant, a cluster of maybe 12 fighters moving in controlled spread. Watched his jaw tighten. Watched something behind his eyes shift from assessment to verdict. Hey. The figure moved before Mark finished the word. Not fast the way Viltrumites were fast, measured tactical built around biology. This was something else. He crossed the distance between himself and the Viltrumite formation in a fraction of a second, and the first impact he made was not a punch. It was an event. The lead Viltrumite, a male Mark recognized as a mid-tier combatant from 2 previous engagements, experienced difficult, simply ceased to be in his current position. He was elsewhere, moving very fast, decelerating into the side of a coalition cruiser with enough force to crater the hull plating. Mark tracked the arc on instinct. The math didn't work. The velocity at point of impact was wrong for a strike at that range. The figure was already on the second target. 3, 4. The Viltrumite formation scattered, not in retreat, but in the involuntary sense each fighter trying to re-establish spatial awareness after something they hadn't anticipated and couldn't process. One of them grabbed a coalition fighter who happened to be nearby and used them as a shield. It didn't help. The figure hit the Viltrumite through the shield. The coalition fighter spun away, injured but alive. The Viltrumite's chest was wrong, caved inward at an angle that didn't come from a single impact. He drifted arms loose and didn't move again. Mark's comms crackled. Invincible. Thaddeus's voice, flat and precise the way it always was, a voice built around removing everything unnecessary. What is that? I don't know. He watched the stranger work through the remnants of the attack wave. I'm about to find out. Assess threat level before engagement. Do not engage independently. Bring it to the command line. We need it contained or neutralized before, yeah. He cut the channel and flew toward the stranger. By the time Mark reached him, the Viltrumite formation had largely redistributed itself into a debris field. The figure floated at the center of it, unhurried. He was examining something on the back of his gauntlet, some kind of display built into the armor, and his expression carried the particular quality of someone who'd expected this to be harder and was mildly disappointed it wasn't. Up close, he looked about Mark's age. It was a strange thing to think in the middle of a battle. It was stranger to feel unsettled by it. That formation had my team pinned. So, thanks, I think. The figure looked up from his gauntlet. The look he gave Mark was calibrating, not curious, but comparative, as if he was matching what he saw against some internal reference and finding the discrepancy mildly irritating. "Which side are you?" Mark gestured at his suit. The yellow and blue was a coalition signifier in this engagement, even if no one had formally registered him. "Them. The side fighting the gray guys." The gray guys were wrong. He said it the way someone identified a typo. Declarative, irritated, already moving on. This whole... He looked around at the battle. His expression did something complicated, caught between recognition and contempt. "This whole thing is wrong." "Okay," Mark said carefully. "What's your name?" The figure looked at him again. This time, the calibration didn't settle. Something shifted, a faint tightening there and gone. "Clark." And then another Viltrumite found them, and the conversation ended. The attack came from below, a pair of fighters in flanking, spread the kind of approach that worked on opponents who thought in 2 dimensions. Against Mark, it forced a split-second calculation. Against the figure beside him, it forced nothing at all. Clark, if that was real, caught the first one by the wrist at full intercept speed and redirected the force of the fighter's own approach back through the joint, clean, precise in a way that contradicted everything else about how he'd hit the previous formation. The second fighter pulled up short, reassessing. Mark took him while he hesitated. That was the advantage of fighting alongside someone unpredictable. The hesitation was real. "You fly with the coalition?" Clark asked, as though they were standing still somewhere quiet. "They're not really a third attacker." Mark broke off and dealt with it. Came back. "It's complicated. I don't fly with anyone." Mark believed that. He wasn't sure why, but he believed it immediately and completely. The northern quadrant was lighting up again, another Viltrumite wave, reorganizing after the disruption. Mark could see Nolan at the edge of his range, moving to intercept. The coalition frigates were repositioning, trying to hold the corridor that Thetis needed clear for the next phase. He needed to be there. He needed to be 3 places simultaneously. "Can you hold this line?" Mark asked. Clark looked at the incoming formation, then back at Mark. "I'll hold whatever I decide to hold." It wasn't agreement. It wasn't a refusal. It was just a description of how things were going to work, delivered with the same flat certainty as everything else he'd said. Mark held that for a second. Decided there wasn't a better option. Decided there probably wasn't going to be a better option for quite a while. "Don't kill anyone from our side." "I'll know which side is wrong." Mark flew north. Behind him, he heard the impact of Clark finding the second wave before they'd finished their approach. He told himself not to think about what wrong meant to someone who'd apparently walked in from nowhere, through a rip in space itself, and already decided the answer. He told himself that for about 4 seconds. Then the battle swallowed him again, and there wasn't room for anything else. Thetis had a voice built for command. Not loud, he didn't need volume. Just a particular quality of certainty, the kind that had kept a fragile coalition of species alive against an empire that had been grinding civilizations into dust for centuries. When he spoke, people moved. "Invincible. The unknown combatant is a liability. Bring him to the command line." Mark was 300 kilometers from the command line, currently holding a Viltrumite's arm behind his back at an angle that would have been called a joint lock if either of them had been standing on ground. They were not. "A little busy," he managed. "That is not a request." The Viltrumite beneath him bucked hard, nearly broke the hold. Mark drove a knee into the back of his rib cage. Something shifted. The bucking stopped. "I don't even know how to give him orders. I don't think he has a comm frequency." "Then find a way to communicate the directive. He has already disabled 6 coalition soldiers." Mark let the Viltrumite go unconscious now, drifting in a slow rotation toward the debris belt 50 kilometers south, and pulled back to altitude. Disabled or disabled, alive. Apparently he distinguished. A pause that carried weight. We cannot rely on that distinction holding. Mark looked north where the shape of the battle had changed. There was a gap in the Viltrumite line, where there hadn't been a gap before. A gap roughly person-shaped, moving at a speed that made tracking it by eye into an exercise in inference. You saw where it had been by the aftermath. "I'll talk to him. You will bring him in." He cut the channel, not rudely, just efficiently. He flew toward the gap. Clark was not hard to find. The simplest method was to locate the highest concentration of Viltrumites in a 60-kilometer radius and look for the one thing in that concentration moving in the wrong direction. Everything else in a battle moved away from danger or toward it with clear purpose. Clark moved through it the way a stone moved through water, not around. Not with just through the medium parting, because it had no other option. Mark caught up at the edge of a debris cluster, the gutted hull of a coalition scout vessel that had taken a direct hit somewhere in the first hour. Clark had a Viltrumite by the collar of his bodysuit and was holding him at arm's length, examining him the way someone examined a document they found disappointing. The Viltrumite was not cooperating with this. He was striking Clark's forearm repeatedly with his free hand. Each strike landed. None of them registered. "They sent you," Clark said without looking at Mark. "Nobody sent me. I came." "Same thing." "It really isn't." Mark stopped a few meters away, close enough for conversation, far enough to give the scene room. "What are you doing with him?" Clark looked at the Viltrumite, then dropped him. The fighter scrambled to reorient, burned distance between them in under a second, and vanished into the debris field without looking back. Deciding what? Whether any of them know what they're doing. He turned to Mark. His expression had settled into something that wasn't quite contempt, like a teacher who'd asked a simple question and gotten the wrong answer so many times that disappointment had calcified into expectation. "They don't. The gray ones. They're just..." He looked out at the battle. "They're strong and they don't care, and that's it. That's their whole thing." That's pretty much accurate. They've been doing it for thousands of years. That doesn't make it right? No, it doesn't. Something moved in Clark's expression. Not softening, more like the momentary acknowledgement that the person across from him had said a true thing, and true things deserved a half-second of recognition before the verdict closed again. "Your commander wants me contained." Clark looked at him evenly. Mark didn't answer fast enough. "That's what he said?" "Contained." Clark let the words sit. "Then tell him no. I don't think Thetis responds well to..." "Tell him I said no. That's the message." He turned back toward the battle. "Go do your part. I'll do mine. We're on the same side here." Clark glanced back at him. One glance, brief measuring. "You might be. You don't know what side I'm on yet." He left before Mark could decide what to do with that. The coalition response team reached Clark's position 11 minutes later. There were 7 of them mid-tier by coalition standards, which put them in a range that could handle most threats short of veteran Viltrumites. Their commander led from center, the formation fanning out in a crescent. Textbook approach for a non-hostile containment. The kind of thing that worked on people who didn't want a confrontation. Clark watched them come. He'd been aware of them for about 4 minutes, ever since their trajectory became obvious. He'd spent those 4 minutes finishing what he'd been doing, working through a cluster of Viltrumite stragglers who'd tried to reform on the eastern edge of the debris belt. There were fewer of them now. They'd redistributed into the debris belt itself, in the involuntary sense. The coalition commander opened comms. His voice came through on a broad channel, the choice of someone who assumed the target lacked their encryption protocols. Unknown combatant. You are operating outside sanctioned engagement parameters. Stand down and submit to escort. Clark said nothing. This is not a hostile approach. We are here to assist with coordination and ensure you're here to put a leash on me. Silence on the channel. That's what escort means, Clark continued. That's what coordination means. That's what all of it means. He looked at their formation. The crescent spread the blocked escape vectors, the way the 2 flanking members had positioned themselves slightly behind his peripheral line. Good form. Someone had trained them well. Someone told you I was an asset. Now you're here to make sure the asset stays pointed in the right direction. The commander's voice careful now. Your capabilities could significantly stop. The word hit the channel like a door closing. Say the next sentence very carefully, because I'm deciding right now whether this is a conversation or a demonstration. Son, it became a demonstration. Not brutal. Clark drew that line somewhere, and it wasn't a line Mark would have predicted from watching him work through the Viltrumite line. The coalition team got bruised and embarrassed, and very suddenly aware of how large the distance was between their best speed and his worst speed. One of them hit a hull panel hard enough to bounce. 2 of them ended up tangled together in a spin they'd be working out for the next 30 seconds. The commander lost his weapon not to a strike, but to a grip that simply opened his hand the way you'd open a jar. Nobody died. Clark dropped the commander's weapon in front of him, watched him pick it up. I'm not your asset. I'm not your liability. I'm not your anything. He looked at the scattered remnants of the crescent. The gray ones are the problem. I'll deal with them when I find them. That's what's happening. He turned and flew back toward the Viltrumite line. The commander stared at the space where he'd been. Mark, who had watched the entire thing from a distance of about 200 meters, descended slowly. You okay? He asked. The commander looked at him. His jaw was tight. His pride was somewhere in the debris belt, probably spinning. Your friend, he said, is going to be a problem. He's not my friend. Mark looked north. And he's already a problem. We just have to decide if the problem is pointed in a useful direction. He went north because north was where the fighting was thickest, and the coalition needed bodies in that gap more than they needed a post-mortem on why the containment approach had been a poor choice. Nolan found Clark an hour later in the middle of a 7-to-1 engagement that had started as 7-to-1 and was currently trending toward 2-to-1. Though the math on which side those numbers favored was not what anyone watching would have expected. He didn't try to approach. He held position 2 kilometers out and watched. Clark fought differently when no one was trying to speak to him, less deliberate. The pauses between strikes shortened to nothing. The movement stopped being readable as a sequence of decisions and became something more like a condition of the space around him. Things broke because they were in proximity to him, not because he chose each one individually. The 5 Viltrumites who'd already disengaged had disengaged with the specific urgency of people who'd reevaluated a situation and found their initial projections significantly wrong. The 2 who remained were trying. Nolan gave them credit. Trying was the right word. Clark took a strike to the face, a real one. The kind of Viltrumite landed when they committed everything to a single moment. His head snapped back. He blinked. Then he looked at the one who'd thrown it. The look lasted about a second. Then he hit back. Nolan watched the aftermath and made his calculations. Not about whether Clark was a threat, that question had an obvious answer. About something more specific. What kind of threat and in which direction, and how you accounted for it in a plan built around components you could predict. The answer was, you didn't. You built around the gap he left the same way you built around a storm. Not by controlling it, by knowing where it was going to hit and making sure your people weren't standing there. His comm chimed. Thetis. Omni-Man. Report on the unknown combatant. He's functional. Nolan's voice gave nothing away. That is not what I asked. He's not going to follow orders. Nolan watched Clark finish the engagement, quick, clean, no wasted motion now that he'd stopped demonstrating and started working. But he's going to keep fighting. That's the best read I have. We need more than that. I know. Nolan pulled back from his observation point. Somewhere to the south, a new signal was cutting across the battlefield's noise, something with a very specific energy signature. He'd seen it before in the intelligence files. Thetis. Is Space Racer in transit a beat? He reaches the engagement perimeter in 40 minutes. Nolan looked north, where Clark was already moving toward the next concentration of Viltrumite resistance, self-assigned, self-directed, answering to nothing. Good. We're going to need the corridor clear by then. Tell Mark to work the eastern flank. I'll take west. A pause. Leave the unknown alone. He'll clear the center on his own. Silence from Thetis. The kind of silence that wasn't agreement, but was the acknowledgement that the alternative approaches had already been tried. 40 minutes, Thetis said, and cut the channel. Nolan flew west. Behind him, the center of the battlefield continued to become significantly less populated with Viltrumites. Nobody was giving orders about that. It was happening anyway. The war had rules until the old man showed up with a gun. Nobody announced him. No coalition broadcast, no coordinated signal flare. One moment the eastern flank was holding the same grinding stalemate it had held for the past 2 hours. Viltrumites pushing coalition, pushing back bodies, trading positions, without either side gaining ground that mattered. The next moment, a hoverbike punched through the periphery of the engagement zone at a speed that made the coalition ship's tracking systems register it as ordnance before they corrected. Space Racer didn't slow down for the correction. The first shot took a Viltrumite out of a 3-person strike group before any of the 3 had registered his approach. No warning arc, no visible charge-up. The infinity ray discharged and the target was simply gone from the position she'd occupied. Not thrown, not wounded, removed the way you removed a variable from an equation when it stopped being relevant. The other 2 turned. He was already past them, the bike banking hard around the spine of a wrecked coalition frigate. The second shot came from behind, which should have been geometrically impossible given the angle of his exit trajectory. The second Viltrumite stopped moving. The third one didn't wait to find out about the third shot. He broke for distance, which was the correct instinct, and about 2 seconds too late. Mark watched all of this from 400 meters away, while in the process of keeping a Viltrumite's hands occupied so he couldn't reach the coalition soldier currently trying to get clear of his grip. That's him. Yes, Nolan said through the comm somewhere to the west. That's him. The coalition soldier got clear. Mark shoved the Viltrumite he'd been wrestling toward the debris field to the south and went to altitude fast enough to get a full read on the engagement zone. Space Racer was already on his fourth target. The Infinity Ray operated on a different principle than anything Mark had encountered, not just power, but specificity. Each shot landed exactly where it was aimed at exactly the velocity required, with no scatter and no overpenetration. The old man shot like he was solving problems, one at a time, neatly. The Viltrumite line was developing a new kind of anxiety. Mark could see it in the spacing fighters who'd been pressing hard, pulling back a half-meter, redistributing their approach angles, doing the rapid, unconscious math that a body does when it realizes that moving in a straight line has become dangerous. They'd adapted to Viltrumite opponents. They'd adapted to coalition weapons. They had no adaptation for this yet. That window wouldn't stay open long. Asang. It closed faster than expected because of what Thetis did next. Mark heard the order come through a short sequence in coalition tactical language that he'd learned to parse over months of operating with them. The translation was approximately, "Release the asset." He had about 4 seconds to wonder which asset before the answer arrived from the hold bay of a coalition mid-class carrier 2 kilometers north. The Ragnar hit the engagement zone like a natural disaster that had decided to have opinions about Viltrumites. It was enormous. That was the first thing, not the size of a large fighter or even the size of a vehicle, but the size of something that had evolved on a world where the baseline physics were different and had never quite fit into spaces built by species from lighter gravity origins. It moved through vacuum the way it had clearly evolved to move on its home terrain, low, fast, without any of the instinctive hesitation that creatures born to atmospheric environments carried when exposed to open space. The second thing was the sound. There was no sound in vacuum. Mark knew this. He registered what the Ragnar did as a pressure wave, transmitted through the debris field hull panels, vibrating dust clouds snapping outward, and his brain converted that into something that wasn't quite sound, but carried the same weight. The third thing was what it did to the nearest Viltrumite it reached. Mark looked away from that part. The Viltrumite line didn't break. Viltrumites didn't break, not in the structural sense, not all at once. But it bent. The fighters nearest the Ragnar's entry point redistributed with a speed that wasn't tactical retreat, so much as pure physical instinct, and the gap that opened between them was the kind of gap that changes the geometry of a fight. Thetis had bought it with one release. The math on that trade was brutal and probably correct. Mark moved to exploit the gap before it closed. Guys, Clark had been working the western edge of the fight. When Space Racer arrived far enough from the eastern flank that he'd clocked the Infinity Ray's discharge as a data point rather than a spectacle, a new variable, high-yield precision guided. He'd filed it and kept moving. The Ragnar was harder to file. He stopped. Surprise was part of it. The larger part was the specific kind of attention a thing demanded when it was against all reasonable expectation interesting. The creature tore through a cluster of Viltrumites with the systematic intensity of something that had been built by millions of years of evolution for exactly this purpose. And the Viltrumites, who were not accustomed to being the smaller animal in any encounter, were responding with something Clark recognized from a very different context. They were responding the way things responded to him. He watched that for a moment. Watched the old man on the bike carve clean lines through the chaos, while the creature carved messy ones, and watched the two of them together do something that neither could have done separately. They made the Viltrumites look like a mob instead of an army. The universe is trying to fix itself, he thought. Badly. But trying. He turned back to the 11 Viltrumites he'd been in the process of separating from each other, and the 3 coalition soldiers they'd had cornered, and he finished what he'd started. Quickly, because the geometry was shifting, and he needed to be somewhere else. The somewhere else was north, where a knot of 40-odd Viltrumites had stopped their advance and were pulling into a tight defensive grouping, the right response to Space Racer's targeting patterns, which required clear angles, and to the Ragnar's advance, which required space to maneuver. 40 fighters packed into a compact sphere was bad for both problems and good for Viltrumite survival. Clark hit the sphere from the outside. Killing wasn't the point, or not the immediate point. He hit it the way you hit a structure when you want to change its shape at the load-bearing points, with enough force to make the whole thing shift. 2 fighters on the outer layer went wide. 3 more in the second layer lost their orientation as the pressure redistributed. The sphere became something more irregular and more interesting to Space Racer's targeting solutions. He moved to the next pocket before the first one could reform. Then the next. The pattern became clear after the third, to him at least. Probably to Nolan, who was good at reading combat geometry. Possibly to Thetis, who read everything. The Viltrumites were trying to solve 3 problems simultaneously: the gun, the creature, and Clark. The gun required cover. The creature required space. Clark required none of the things that made cover or space useful. You could not optimize for all 3 at once. He found a 4th group reforming on the far side of the debris belt, a disciplined pullback led by a Viltrumite who was repositioning her fighters into a spread that would have cut Space Racer's angle within 90 seconds. Competent. Maybe even smart. He went through that cluster fast enough that competent and smart didn't help. But Space Racer noticed. He didn't signal, it didn't alter his firing arc or acknowledge Clark in any tactical broadcast. But something in where his shots landed over the following 10 minutes carried a different weight and anticipation, like he was reading Clark's movements and adjusting his own targeting to account for the gaps Clark was creating before Clark finished creating them. The old man had done this before. Not with Clark specifically, but with someone who fought the way Clark fought. He knew what a disruptor looked like from the outside, and he knew how to be the blade that followed the fracture. Clark, for his part, didn't look at Space Racer directly, didn't acknowledge the coordination, but he felt the shape of it, the way 2 things moving independently could develop a rhythm without planning one. And he filed it in the category of things that were temporarily acceptable, because they served the purpose. The purpose being, make this stop faster. He felt the change before he saw it. Not the Ragnar, the creature was still audible as a pressure on his left, having apparently decided that a group of 6 Viltrumites on the carrier hull represented an appropriate challenge. Not Space Racer, the Infinity Ray was still discharging in its clean, methodical sequence to the east. A pressure shift. Not the Ragnar, the creature was still audible as pressure on his left, having apparently decided that a group of 6 Viltrumites on the carrier hull represented an appropriate challenge. Not Space Racer, the Infinity Ray was still discharging in its clean, methodical sequence to the east. A different weight entirely. The way a room changes when the person with the most authority in it walks through the door. Clark turned north. Thrag was not difficult to identify. He moved through the Coalition Viltrumite tangle the way very few things moved through any space with the specific gravity of someone who had never, in his entire existence, needed to calculate whether he could handle what was in front of him. The calculation simply didn't run. He had hit Space Racer's position from 2 kilometers out before most of the nearby combatants had registered his trajectory, and Space Racer, who had handled everything else tonight, with the calm of someone doing routine maintenance, had gone wide. Wide meant off the bike. The hover cycle tumbled automated stabilizers firing, pulling it into a holding arc 200 meters from where Space Racer hit the hull of a Coalition cruiser hard enough to leave an impression. The Infinity Ray followed its owner. Slowly. Not lost, the weapon had a connection to Space Racer that Clark had clocked as something more than mechanical. But the connection required proximity, and Thrag had created a significant proximity problem. The Viltrumite line, which had been bending, straightened. Clark watched Thrag scan the combat spread with the methodical patience of a general taking inventory. The inventory reached Clark, stopped. Thrag looked at him the way commanders looked at problems that didn't fit existing categories. Not concern, not caution. Just the cold attention of someone identifying what needed to be addressed and assigning it a priority number. Clark looked back. He had a priority number of his own. It was lower than Thrag's. Later, he thought. But not much later. He broke north. The pack had a rhythm. That was the word for it. Not a formation, not a battle line, but a rhythm, the kind that developed when enough bodies with the same training and the same biology fought long enough together to stop thinking individually. The Viltrumite advance had that rhythm. Push read counter-press. Repeat. They'd been running it for centuries across dozens of systems, and they ran it here the same way. Relentless, efficient, absorbing casualties without breaking stride. Then Thrag walked through them. Not pushed through, not cut through. Walked the pack parting the same way a current parts around bedrock, automatically without instruction. Because the bedrock had always been there, and the water had always known to move. The fighters nearest him didn't receive a signal or a look. They simply redistributed, opening a lane, and Thrag moved through it toward the problem he'd identified. The problem was Space Racer. He crossed 2 kilometers in a time that didn't register on any coalition tracking system as a transit. It registered as an arrival, the before and after states with no observable between. Space Racer had his bike banked hard into a firing solution on a Viltrumite knot at the far edge of the debris belt. The infinity ray charged the shot already committed. The shot never landed. Thrag hit him from below, one arm, driving up through the bike's chassis, the other catching Space Racer's shoulder and continuing the upward momentum until the separation was complete. The hover cycle tumbled. Space Racer hit the hull of a coalition cruiser chest first, hard enough that the impact left a record. Silence on every coalition channel for about 2 full seconds. Then Thaida's Space Racer, report. Space Racer's response was the sound of someone taking inventory of their own structural integrity. Functional, he said. The word came out like a decision. I need the gun. The infinity ray was already moving toward him, pulled by whatever connection existed between weapon and owner, slow. Because the distance was significant, and something about the impact had disrupted the link. Too slow for the next 30 seconds. Maybe 60. Thrag didn't pursue. He turned instead to the broader field, taking his accounting. Mark saw it from the east. He'd been running intercept on a Viltrumite pair who'd gotten behind a coalition fire team, pulling one of them off long enough for the fire team to regroup. Standard work. The kind of thing that didn't feel like it mattered individually, but added up over the course of an engagement to the difference between a line that held and one that collapsed. He let go of the Viltrumite when Thrag arrived, not by choice, by the involuntary prioritization that happened when something entered a space and immediately became the largest thing in it. Dad, into the comm. Nothing else. I see him. What do we? Nothing yet. Nolan's voice was flat and careful, in the way it got when he was thinking faster than he was talking. Let it develop. Let it develop meant watch the Grand Regent of the Viltrumite Empire orient himself toward your position and do nothing about it. Mark held altitude. Watched Thrag's gaze sweep the field, methodical, unhurried, the accounting of a commander who had never in his operational life needed to rush an assessment because nothing had ever meaningfully threatened his window to complete it. The gaze reached Clark. Stopped. Thrag had the same reaction. Space Racer had recognition of a variable that didn't fit the existing model, a half-beat of recalibration. But where Space Racer had adapted and moved on, Thrag held the contact a half-beat longer. Clark was already moving toward him. The collision was not what Mark expected. He'd braced for the kind of impact that rewrote the local geometry, the type he'd seen Clark produce when he wasn't pulling anything. The type that left marks on space-time that you felt as wrongness before you understood them as damage. He'd expected Thrag to go wide or backward or through something. Instead, they hit each other, mutually, at speed, and neither of them moved. For about 2 seconds, they were simply pressed against each other, in the vacuum, an immovable object, meeting the closest thing to an unstoppable force the Viltrumite Empire had ever produced. And the product of that meeting was a shockwave that rolled outward in every direction and knocked 6 nearby fighters, 3 from each side, into uncontrolled tumbles. Then Thrag's arm came up. The blow landed on Clark's jaw. Real full commitment, no calculation of reception. Thrag didn't fight to wound or control. He fought to end, and every strike carried that intention with it. Clark's head snapped back. His neck rolled with it. He blinked once. And then he looked at Thrag with an expression that was not pain or anger. It was interest. The specific kind of interest that came with novelty, the recognition that something had happened that didn't happen often. Okay, he hit back. The strike was one-handed loose, the kind of thing you'd throw at something you were curious about, rather than something you were trying to remove. It caught Thrag across the chest, and the shockwave that came with it was not a shockwave. In the usual sense, it moved wrong, arrived before the impact registered. Displaced the fighters within 40 meters of the exchange, as if the space between them had briefly disagreed with itself. Thrag took it. His bodysuit cracked across the chest emblem. He drove forward into it. Committed relentless, the same engine he'd been running for his entire existence. Clark let him come. Months, Nolan moved closer, though not close enough to enter the radius of whatever was happening between them. He wanted the read. He needed to understand what he was watching, because understanding it was the only way to build anything around it. Thrag fought the way Nolan remembered from the last time they'd been on the same side of a situation. Or rather, the last time Nolan had watched Thrag fight, which was the same thing as watching a natural force that had learned to have preferences. He struck fast, struck in combinations, used his grip strength to control distance and dictate exchanges. No wasted motion, no ego in the mechanics of it. Clark absorbed it. That was the word, absorbed, the way a cliff absorbed a wave. Not without effect. Nolan could see the cumulative force registering somewhere in Clark's posture, a slight shift in how he was distributing impact. But registering was not the same as mattering. Thrag's full output was making Clark pay attention, which was not the same as making Clark respond. Then Clark reached out and grabbed Thrag by the forearm. Not to strike, to steer. He redirected Thrag's own forward momentum, the tremendous, implacable kinetic mass of the Grand Regent at full press sideways, the way you'd redirect a vehicle, and sent him through the nearest concentration of his own fighters. The Viltrumites scattered. 2 took direct contact and went into the debris belt at bad angles. 3 more had to abandon their approach vectors to avoid the same outcome. Thrag arrested his trajectory, came back. Clark was waiting where he'd been. "You lead them," Clark said. It wasn't a question. Thrag didn't answer with words. "That's the problem." Clark caught the next strike on his forearm, bone against bone, the impact ringing outward, and shoved. "It's all wrong. This..." Another strike caught redirected. "The Empire. The way you built it. All of it." Thrag drove a knee into Clark's ribs. Clark's breath hissed out. He took a half-step back, voluntary, the first real give in the exchange, and looked at Thrag as though the knee had been a conversational point worth acknowledging. "You're strong." Clark looked at him. "That's the thing, isn't it? You're the strongest one they have. And the best you could do with that was this. The contempt in it was absolute, not rage contempt, which was worse because rage at least acknowledged an equal. Thrag hit him again, and this time he didn't hold what he had. The impact carried everything. Full Viltrumite peak, the product of a physiology refined by a civilization that had spent millennia selecting for exactly this, and it drove Clark back 30 meters through open space before he arrested the trajectory. Clark floated, ran his tongue along the inside of his cheek, looked at his hand, then looked back at Thrag. "There it is," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's what you actually have." Space Racer had the gun back. The reconnection had taken 91 seconds longer than he'd wanted, shorter than he'd feared. He pulled himself onto the recovered bike, ran a rapid systems check, and lifted back to operational altitude. The field had shifted while he was grounded. The Viltrumite line had pressed the advantage of his absence, gaining 200 meters on the northern corridor, the corridor that Thetis needed clear. Not catastrophic. Recoverable, but the window to recover it was narrowing. He opened the tactical channel. "Space Racer, back online. Northern corridor compromised 200 meters. Thetis, confirmed. Re-establish firing solutions. Priority on the northern arc." "Understood." He banked toward the corridor. The infinity ray read the targeting parameters calibrated. He fired twice, opening the lane, and felt the rhythm of it settle back into place. The specific cadence of solving problems one at a time neatly that had been his work for longer than most civilizations had existed. To the south, Clark was doing something that couldn't accurately be called fighting. Space Racer watched it for exactly as long as it took him to identify that Thrag was not gaining ground, that Clark was not finishing it, and that the exchange between them was therefore operating on a logic he didn't need to understand in order to account for. He noted the radius of the shockwave effects. He adjusted his firing arcs to avoid it. He continued working, one problem at a time. Mark reached Nolan's position and held there. Below them, or what counted as below, in the absence of a planetary reference, the exchange continued. Thrag pressing with everything, Clark giving ground, in controlled increments, neither of them accumulating the kind of decisive advantage that ended things. "Why isn't he finishing it?" Mark asked. Nolan was quiet for a moment. "Because he doesn't want to finish it. Not yet." "That's..." Mark watched Clark redirect Thrag through his own fighters again a second time with the same almost clinical detachment. "That's insane. Thrag is a problem Clark is choosing to have." Nolan's jaw was tight. "The question is what problem he's creating for us while he has it." The answer arrived as a new signal on the tactical channel. Thetis, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone announcing something that had been prepared for a long time and was only now permitted to be said aloud. "All units. Phase 2 authorization granted. Space Racer, you have your window." Mark went still. The window. The northern corridor cleared by Space Racer's last 2 shots, and by whatever Clark had inadvertently created when he'd thrown Thrag through the Viltrumite concentration on the northern edge. Clear enough? Maybe barely. "That's it." Yes. Nolan was already recalculating trajectory. "We need to move." To the south, Clark caught another strike and glanced up. Not at them, but at the northern corridor. The open lane, the thing that had become possible in the last 4 minutes, partly by design and partly by the side effects of a fight nobody had planned for. His expression didn't change. But his next strike pushed Thrag south, away from the corridor, putting more distance between the Grand Regent and the lane that Space Racer was about to use. It might have been coincidence. Mark didn't think it was. "We go now." Nolan turned north. They went. Thetis called it a plan. It was really a controlled fall. Space Racer opens the path. No preamble, no context for anyone who hadn't been following. We fly the line he creates. The core is unstable. Once he fires, we have seconds, not minutes. If we slow down inside, it closes around us. Mark looked at Viltrum. It hung in the middle distance, enormous and out of place, in the way planets were out of place, when you were close enough to see them as objects rather than backgrounds. A world built on conquest. 10,000 years of it minimum. The kind of place that had never once considered the possibility of this moment. And if we make it through, Mark asked, the planet becomes uninhabitable. The Empire loses its home and its symbol in one event. Thetis paused. It will not end the war, but it changes what winning looks like for them. He looked at Mark. That matters. Nolan was already running the trajectory math. Mark could tell by his silence a particular stillness that meant he was somewhere inside the numbers testing variables, mapping the route. His father had always been better at this than he let on. All those years pretending to be human, pretending the calculations didn't run constantly behind his eyes. The timing window. Nolan's eyes were somewhere else running numbers. Once Space Racer fires, we have how long before the access point closes? 14 seconds from initial penetration to lobe collapse. And transit time through the path. 11 seconds at the velocity the shot creates. 3 seconds of margin. Mark did the math himself and came up with the same number, then sat with it. We could die in a planet. Yes, Thetis said. Nolan looked at Mark, not asking, informing. This is what we're doing. Mark looked back, found something in his chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite readiness, but was somewhere between the two in the territory that combat had taught him, was where real decisions lived. Okay. Sund, Space Racer received the authorization without comment. He was already repositioned on the northern arc, the Infinity Ray, calibrated on a firing solution that had taken him 40 minutes to calculate and 2 to refine. The shot wasn't a strike. It was a key cut to an exact shape designed to thread between the tectonic stress points of a world that had been geologically surveyed by Coalition intelligence 6 years before this moment. You should have waited for the Ragnar. Thetis, we could not wait. I know you couldn't. I'm telling you anyway. He settled the bike's stabilizers, felt the weapon's readiness through the connection that had no good word in any language he spoke. Not symbiosis, not extension, something closer to agreement. When this goes wrong, remember that I told you. If it goes wrong, you will not be in a position to say so. Fair. He lined up the shot. Ready on your mark. Mark heard the exchange on the tactical channel and chose not to say anything about it, which was the right call. Mark, Thetis said. Space Racer fired. But the shot was not visible as light. It registered as a pressure event, a focused column of force that crossed the distance between the hoverbike and the planet's surface in a time too short to parse, penetrating the crust along the path Space Racer had mapped, and driving deep into the mantle. The crust cracked along the entry line, not explosively surgically like a seam, splitting at exactly the right stress point. Then the light came from inside as the wound reached something that didn't want to be reached. Now. Nolan grabbed Mark's arm, not gently. They went from stationary to the velocity required in the time it took Mark's body to register that they were moving. And then the planet was very large and getting larger very fast, and the entry point was a burning line in its surface, and they were aimed at it. Thetis led. He hit the opening first, a man who had spent decades planning this moment and had perhaps always known it would kill him one way or another. Nolan followed, pulling Mark with him. Mark's free arm went up on instinct against the heat, which was significant and irrelevant because the suit had limits, but exceeding them wasn't the current problem. The current problem was the walls. The channel Space Racer's shot had created was not stable. It was a wound in a living geological system, and living systems responded to wounds by closing them. Mark could feel the pressure on both sides as they drove through, could feel the rock that wasn't quite rock trying to reclaim the space they were occupying. He understood viscerally what Thetis meant by 14 seconds. Understood it in his shoulders and his jaw and the base of his spine. Nolan's grip didn't let go. They drove through the core. 11 seconds that felt like 11 minutes, the heat and pressure climbing in ways that a body like Mark's could survive, but not ignore, the channel narrowing behind them as they went the sense of the planet attempting to reassert itself against the violation of its center. They punched out the other sides. Outside, Clark had stopped counting Viltrumites. Not because there weren't enough to count. There always were. The Empire had built its entire existence on the premise that numbers and ferocity were the same thing as inevitability. He'd stopped counting because counting implied a limit, and he had no interest in discovering whether he had one today. The wave of fighters turning back toward Viltrum had started 4 minutes ago when the shot landed and the planet's surface lit up. The turn wasn't ordered. He could see that in the inconsistency of it, different fighters making the same choice at different moments. The instinct to defend, home overriding the instinct to hold a line. It created the kind of disorganization that was tactically worse than a retreat, because a retreat had direction. This was just a mob with a destination. He put himself between the mob and the destination. The first wave hit him and scattered. He let the ones on the edges go. They weren't going to affect what was happening inside the dying world. They were going to reach the surface and stand on it while it came apart under them. He focused on the ones with enough speed and enough sense of trajectory to potentially intercept the 3 people currently driving through the core. 4 of those. Then 3. Then a knot of 7 who'd formed up with clear intent to flank the entry point. He hit the knot from above and took it apart fast, thorough, no piece left in a configuration it could reassemble from. The fighters went wide. A few came back. He was already elsewhere. Space Racer, from his position on the Ark, had 2 clear shots into the Viltrumite concentration that was reforming on Viltrum's northern hemisphere. He took them. The concentration stopped reforming. The planet groaned. Not a sound. A transmission through the debris field and the hulls of every ship in range. A vibration that said something large and structural had just made a decision it couldn't reverse. Mark felt it 100 kilometers out on the other side of the planet from where he'd gone in. Clark felt it as a pressure behind his sternum there and gone. Then Viltrum came apart. Checked. It wasn't an explosion. Explosions were sudden single event defined by their moment of maximum violence. This was a process, the crust fracturing along lines that had been quietly optimal for fracture for geological ages. The mantle releasing pressures it had held for longer than most civilizations had existed. The whole structure making the transition from world to event over the course of about 40 seconds. The shock wave, when it arrived, had accumulated over those 40 seconds. It hit Clark like the planet had opinions about him specifically. He didn't go unconscious. He came close. There was a moment where the signal between intention and action had significant delay, where the light was off, and the geometry of the debris field didn't resolve into coherent shape. He registered it as data shockwave large recovery required. His body was handling it, the cellular machinery that ran on stored solar energy, grinding through the disruption, as it always did completely, without his conscious input. He steadied, looked around. The battlefield had reorganized itself into chaos fighters from both sides, coming around at different rates, ships repositioning the tight geometry of the engagement, dissolving into scattered individuals, trying to re-establish where they were and who was near them. Coalition soldiers pulling themselves upright. Viltrumites doing the same. Both sides blinking in the light of a debris field that used to be a world. Across the field at distance, he found Thrag. Thrag was upright. He was looking at the debris field that had been his homeworld. His expression was not grief exactly, something harder. The look of someone who had built their existence around a fixed point and watched it cease to exist. On the Coalition tactical channel, Thetis' voice came through, strained but controlled. All Viltrumite forces, this engagement is over. Stand down. We can discuss terms. Thrag turned toward the source of the voice. Mark pulling himself to altitude with one arm. The other had taken damage during the transit hairline fractures he was aware of only because Nolan had told him, because he'd stopped feeling his forearm around the 8-second mark, saw the turn. Saw what it meant. Thetis, he started. But Thrag was already moving, and Mark's arm was broken in a way that mattered, and the distance was too much. Nolan reached him first. The shockwave didn't discriminate. That was the thing about planetary destruction, it didn't care whose side you were on. The debris cloud that had been Viltrum expanded outward, at velocities that made tactical positioning irrelevant, and the pressure front that rode ahead of it hit everyone within 300 kilometers at roughly the same moment, with roughly the same force. Coalition fighters went dark. Viltrumites went dark. Ships that hadn't taken hull damage in the entire engagement lost our systems to the electromagnetic pulse that preceded the physical wave. For about 8 seconds, the war stopped. Not ended. Stopped the way a clock stops, when you pull the battery still intact, still wound, just no longer running. Everyone who could be knocked unconscious was. Everyone who couldn't be was in the process of figuring out what had just happened to their spatial reference, their hearing, their sense of where the horizon was supposed to be. Clark hit the shockwave like a wall. He'd seen it coming, registered the expansion front, calculated the arrival, had about a half second to decide whether to run or brace. He braced. The decision wasn't tactical, so much as instinctive. He didn't run from things. The wall hit, and the 8 seconds that followed were the closest thing to silence he'd experienced since arriving in this universe. Not unconsciousness. A kind of suspension body handling the physics of it mind, waiting for the body to finish. He was upright at the 6-second mark. Took stock. The field was still. Dozens of bodies drifting in slow rotation, most of them alive. He could see the movement of breathing in chests, the slow arc of limbs trailing the particular limpness that was unconsciousness rather than death. Coalition and Viltrumite alike scattered through the debris. North of him, a cluster of 8 Viltrumites had come around faster than the rest. Combat veterans enhanced endurance. The ones who lasted longest always came back soonest. They were already orienting, already identifying the Coalition command position. The command position where Thetis had been. Clark went north. He reached the cluster before they reached their target, and the next 40 seconds were not complicated. He took them apart with the efficiency of someone who had stopped being interested in demonstrations and started being interested in speed. No contempt, no message, just removal. Each fighter redirected into the debris field or into each other until the 8 were no longer a coherent threat. The last one went wide. Clark turned south. He was scanning for Mark and Nolan when he felt the shift, not pressure this time, not electromagnetic, but the unmistakable weight of Thrag moving at full intention. He'd learned to read that signature over days of contact. It had a gravity to it, a sense of mass that didn't come from physics alone. He turned southeast. Thetis was standing, barely one hand braced against the hull of the Coalition command vessel, the other raised with the palm outward, the universal posture of someone attempting to stop something with presence rather than force. His voice carried on the open tactical channel, strained but clear, still carrying the particular authority of a man who had spent his life making other people's futures his problem. It's over. Your home is gone. There is nothing left to fight for. Stand down. All of you. We can negotiate terms that... Thrag covered 40 meters in a movement that didn't have intermediate states. Clark saw it, registered it, was already moving, but moving from a position with the cluster of 8 between him and that 40 meters of vacuum, the arithmetic of distance and velocity, running in the same half-second as the arithmetic of what was happening and what could not be prevented. Thrag was faster than calculation. Thrag had always been faster than calculation in the way that things were fast, when they'd been doing exactly one thing for their entire existence. The sound that the action made transmitted through the hull of the command vessel and through the debris field and through the suits of everyone near enough to receive it. Clark stopped moving. There was a moment short, maybe 2 seconds, where he held position in the vacuum and looked at what Thrag had done and registered it in the same flat data processing way he registered everything. Then something happened behind his eyes that wasn't data processing. Something older and less organized. The particular anger of someone who had watched a story take the worst possible turn and had been close enough to know they should have been able to stop it. This universe, he thought, always the worst version. He moved. Thrag had turned toward Mark. Mark had pulled himself to one knee, his damaged arm held against his chest, the fractures Nolan had warned him about. Now the secondary problem behind the larger problem of Thrag bearing down on him with the intent of someone settling an account. Nolan was between them. Barely the shockwave had taken more out of him than he'd let on. But between them, which was where Nolan had always ended up when Mark was in the path of something large. Thrag hit Nolan. The blow carried the full weight of what had just happened, the homeworld, the legacy, the Empire's history reduced to debris in 40 seconds, and Nolan received it, like someone who had made peace with being the thing that stood between the unacceptable and his son. He went wide. Not out, Nolan didn't go out from single blows, but wide, tumbling, buying seconds he had chosen to spend on purpose. Mark threw his good arm forward. It was the wrong play against Thrag, and he knew it while he was doing it, the same way you knew things were wrong while they were happening. And did them anyway, because they were the things that needed doing. The strike landed on Thrag's forearm, deflected, cost Mark his balance, and got him nothing useful except one more second of Thrag's attention aimed at him instead of at Nolan's retreating trajectory. Thrag closed the distance. The next blow landed on Mark's chest and drove him backward into the hull of a Coalition frigate hard enough to crack the plating behind him. His vision whited out. He heard metal. He heard his own breath leave his body in a way that suggested several things about his structural integrity that he didn't want to verify right now. He heard something else, a sound that wasn't a punch or an impact or the metal of a ship, a sound that was the absence of a sound. The sudden cessation of Thrag's forward momentum cut off the way a recording cuts off when you yank the cable. Mark blinked his vision clear. Clark had Thrag by the collar of his bodysuit, not gripping, holding the way you held something when you wanted it to understand the difference between being held and being free. Thrag's feet weren't touching anything. The Grand Regent of the Viltrumite Empire hung in the vacuum with an expression that was working through several stages of response in rapid succession, surprise rage assessment, the particular cold recalibration of someone deciding how to handle a new problem. You killed him. Not an accusation, a verdict. The same tone you'd use to note that someone had broken something that couldn't be unbroken. Thrag drove both hands upward between Clark's forearms in the conventional break for this kind of grip, and it worked. The grip opened, and then he drove forward into Clark with the full mass and momentum of his body. And the two of them went backward through 30 meters of vacuum before Clark arrested the trajectory. Thrag struck twice during the transit. Both landed. Clark's head snapped left then right. His grip on the situation, not the physical grip, but the broader one, the measured management of how much he was applying and where loosened a fraction. He let it. He hit back with his right hand and put everything into the geometry of it, not the force, not initially, but the angle driving up and into Thrag's center of gravity. So the impact carried through rather than at the way you hit something when you wanted the wave to travel. The shock wave that left his fist moved differently from the force of it. It arrived before the physical contact registered, and the space between them shuddered in a way that vacuum didn't shudder, and Thrag went backward 30 meters without the arc that physics required. The 12 Viltrumites nearest them went wide simultaneously. Not from the shock wave, directly from the pressure gradient, it created the brief disagreement between adjacent sections of space-time that expressed itself as a sudden unanimous conviction in 12 bodies that they were somewhere they didn't want to be. Thrag arrested his own trajectory, came back. He was bleeding from the corner of his mouth. He wiped it with the back of his hand, looked at what was there, and his expression did something Clark recognized. Not fear, not even surprise. The acknowledgement reluctant controlled a thing he was choosing to permit, rather than something that was happening to him. That the math on this exchange was not what he'd expected. "You won't kill me." "Not yet." Clark looked at him. "You know what the worst part is?" Thrag said nothing. "You could have been the thing that made this universe better. Strong enough, old enough. You had everything it takes." Clark gestured at the debris field that had been Viltrum. "And you built that. We built an empire. You built a machine that runs on other people's pain." Clark's voice didn't rise. "I've seen that story. I know how it ends." He looked at Thrag steadily. "Go. Take what's left. Think about whether it's worth trying to rebuild it." Thrag held the eye contact for 3 seconds. Then he turned. Not in retreat and decision, the movement of someone choosing to end a thing on their own terms rather than having it ended for them. He signaled his remaining forces with a gesture that carried no words and needed none. The Viltrumites, who were still functional, began to gather, moving in the controlled way of soldiers following a withdrawal order rather than breaking and running. Clark watched them go. Nolan pulled up beside him. His face had the look it got when he'd taken serious damage and was in the process of not mentioning it. "You let him walk. For now. He'll rebuild. I know." Clark looked at the debris field. At the space where Thetis had been. Something moved in his expression, not grief, not exactly, but the weight of watching something end that shouldn't have ended this way. "He'll try." Mark came up on his other sidearm, still folded against his chest, moving at about 60% of his normal speed and pretending it was more. He looked at the space Thrag had occupied. He didn't say anything for a moment. "What do we do now?" he finally asked. Clark looked at the withdrawal the Viltrumites pulling together, pulling back the beginning of an end that wasn't finished yet. "Now." He turned north where the Coalition command vessel was still broadcasting Thetis's last open channel, still transmitting into silence, because no one had shut it down yet. Now this universe has to figure out what it does with what's left. He moved toward the withdrawal, not to stop it, to make sure it cost what it was supposed to cost. Thrag didn't stop. That was the thing Mark kept failing to account for, the assumption buried somewhere in his training and his instincts that loss on the scale of an entire homeworld would produce a pause, a beat of something, Grief, rage, recalibration. Even Viltrumites were allowed that. Thrag didn't take the beat. He came out of the debris scatter from the shockwave. And he found Mark, and he closed the distance with the same mechanical intent he'd carried through the entire engagement, as if the planet that bore his species' name had not just been reduced to expanding rubble, as if nothing had changed, except perhaps the priority ranking on his target list. Mark's good arm came up. The other one was still three-quarters useless, the fractures knitted enough to move, but not enough to trust. He caught the first blow on his forearm and felt the bone flex in a way that suggested that the knitting was about to become unknitting. And he stepped into it, because stepping away gave Thrag the angle he wanted. "Dad, I see him." Nolan hit Thrag from the left at full speed. It was a good angle, a committed approach, the kind of move that would have knocked a lesser Viltrumite into a different time zone. Thrag rolled with it instead of absorbing it. A technical distinction that mattered enormously, and used the rotation to drive an elbow back into Nolan's shoulder, hard enough that the joint separation was audible through their suit contact. Nolan didn't go down. He went sideways, which was different. Thrag returned to Mark. The next blow landed on Mark's chest, and he went back and hit the hull of something large enough that stopping against it didn't feel like stopping so much as being stopped. Stars. Not the real kind, the internal kind, the pressure event blossom behind the eyes that meant something important had just been stressed past its preferred operating parameters. He pushed off the hull. Thrag was already raising his arm for the follow. Clark arrived between them. He didn't announce it. He was simply not there. And then he was occupying the space between Mark and Thrag's descending arm with the settled certainty of something that had decided where it was going to be and was now there. The arm came down, and Clark's forearm came up, and the collision produced a crack that rolled through the debris scatter like a second smaller shockwave. Thrag's arm stopped. They held the contact for half a second, Clark's forearm against Thrag's, the full mass and intent of the Grand Regent pressing down the full implacability of whatever Clark was pressing back. Then Clark shoved and Thrag went back 3 meters, and the half second was over. "You again. Me again." Clark looked at him with the patient contempt of someone who had been waiting for a conversation to reach an obvious conclusion every time. Thrag came back in fast. The attack shifting from the previous overhead drive to a lateral combination, 2 strikes high, 1 low. The adjustment of a combatant who had correctly identified that the previous approach wasn't producing results. Clark deflected the first, took the second across the jaw, caught the third by the wrist. He didn't redirect this time. He pulled. Thrag came forward, and Clark drove his free hand into the center of Thrag's chest in an uppercut that carried something wrong in its geometry. The force arrived at a slightly different time than the contact registered before it should have. And the 12 Viltrumites, reforming 50 meters north, all staggered at once like something had briefly disagreed with the space they were occupying. Thrag went back, further than he should have, at an arc that didn't match the angle of the blow. He corrected mid-transit with the reflexes of someone who had been correcting mid-transit for centuries and understood the vocabulary of his own body in motion. He stopped himself at 40 meters, looked at Clark, looked at the Viltrumites around him, the ones who had staggered, who were pulling themselves back to orientation. Some of them shaking their heads with the expression of people who couldn't identify what had just happened to their equilibrium, but were aware that something had. You can't be everywhere. I don't need to be everywhere. Clark looked north, where another group was trying to consolidate. Then back at Thrag. I just need to be here. And Thrag made the decision in the space of 1 breath. Mark saw it happen the moment the calculus shifted, the split second where Thrag's posture changed from engaging to managing. Not retreat. Thrag did not retreat. But there was a difference between advancing into a position and holding a position, and Thrag understood it in the way that commanders understood things, which was faster than anyone else in the room. He called something across the Viltrumite frequency, short-clipped the language Mark had been learning to parse. The translation was approximately pull back by unit, hold your number, regroup south of the scatter. Disciplined, controlled. The kind of withdrawal that kept an army, instead of turning it into a rout. Clark let the order land. Let the nearest units start moving. Then he went after the ones moving fastest. Not all of them. That was the thing Mark noticed hovering at altitude with Nolan beside him. Both of them watching this with the particular attention of people who were trying to extract tactical information from a situation they had very limited influence over. Clark didn't pursue every retreating Viltrumite. He picked. He identified the groups that were consolidating with the most discipline, the ones that would arrive at Thrag's rally point in the best condition. And he hit those specifically, and hit them hard enough that their arrival would be significantly delayed and significantly reduced. It was Mark realized exactly what a commander would do, which was a thought that sat uncomfortably in his chest, because Clark had made it abundantly clear he wasn't anyone's commander. He's culling the strong ones. Yeah. Not because Thetis asked him to. No. Mark watched a group of 4 Viltrumites, who had been moving in tight formation, scatter under a single strike from Clark that produced the same spatial wrongness as the earlier blow against Thrag, the stagger, the brief confusion, the sense that the air around the impact point had briefly changed its mind. He's doing it because he wants the ones who get away to be the ones who know they got away. Nolan was quiet for a moment. That's worse than just killing them. I know. Thrag reached the rally point with 60% of what he'd brought into the engagement. Mark could see it from altitude, the gathering tighter and more ordered than a routed force had any right to be. Thrag moving through it with the economy of motion of someone taking stock and finding the stock acceptable. Bloody, reduced, but not broken. Never broken. Space Racer held his position on the arc, the infinity ray tracking, but not firing. He'd asked Nolan for confirmation on rules of engagement 10 minutes ago, and Nolan had said, wait, which was the right call, and also a call that was going to get more complicated the longer it was in effect. Clark was not at the rally point. He was working the outer edge of the withdrawal, picking off the stragglers who had decided that Thrag's authority didn't extend to their personal survival calculus. They were learning that Clark's did. Mark descended toward Thrag's position, not close enough to be immediately in striking range, but close enough that conversation was possible without broadcasting it to everyone in the vicinity. It's over. Thrag looked at him. The look carried no particular heat, just assessment, the accounting of a man running numbers. Is it? You lost the homeworld. You've lost half your forces. Mark kept his voice level. Difficult when his chest was still doing something complicated from the earlier impact, but level. What's left to fight for? The same thing there was always left to fight for. Thrag looked past him toward the distant point in the solar system where the blue-green smear of Earth was visible to eyes like theirs. Survival. Continuation. The species. Mark felt the shape of it before Thrag said it. We have an offer, Thrag said. One your kind will accept, because the alternative is something neither of us wants. You're in no position to make... I'm in exactly the position to make it. Thrag's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. Listen to what I'm offering before you decide what position I'm in. Mark closed his mouth. In his peripheral vision, he could see Clark watching from 200 meters out. Not moving, not approaching, just watching with the expression of someone observing a process. They had no interest in participating in, but were cataloging for later reference. the expression of someone who had already decided that whatever deal was struck here would eventually need to be corrected. Nolan descended beside Mark. "Let him talk," Nolan said quietly. To Mark. Not to Thrag, and not as though Thrag's permission was required. "We need to know what he's offering." Thrag nodded once. Not agreement, not respect. Just the acknowledgement that the correct sequence of events was now occurring. He began to talk. Earth was still there. Mark hadn't let himself believe it until he could see it, until the blue-green smear in the distance resolved into continents and cloud cover and the geography of a planet he'd grown up on. He'd been running worst-case scenarios for the entire transit back, building the math of how long Thrag's forces could have been operating without constraint while the Coalition engagement kept everyone's attention on the other side of the system. The math kept arriving at bad numbers. But Earth was still there. They held back. For now. Mark's arm had been splinted during transit, improvised Coalition medical functional enough. He flexed the fingers on that hand and got 3 of them to respond. Good enough. Thrag was keeping them in reserve. Leverage. Yeah. The word sat between them for a moment. Leverage meant the war hadn't ended when Viltrum broke apart. It had just moved to a different board with different pieces arranged under new pressure. Behind them, Clark flew without speaking. He'd maintained position throughout the transit, back present, neither approaching nor dropping away, his silence carrying the weight of someone who had assessed the situation and was waiting to see what it produced. Mark had stopped trying to read that silence about 2 hours ago. He'd need all his attention for what was coming. Thrag was waiting in high orbit. He hadn't come down. That was deliberate, the choice of someone who understood optics, who knew that descending to a planet's surface was the gesture of a supplicant, and that he was not here as a supplicant. He floated at the edge of the thermosphere with 37 Viltrumites arrayed behind him, in loose formation, the remnants of an empire that had consumed civilizations for 10,000 years. They still looked dangerous. That was the thing Mark kept having to remind himself. Reduced didn't mean broken, and 37 Viltrumites, with nothing left to lose, was a different problem than 37 Viltrumites acting as one component of a larger machine. "I expected you sooner." Thrag didn't move from his position at the thermosphere's edge. "We had to confirm Earth was intact." "It is. I gave no order to touch it." A pause. "I wanted you to see that I could have." Nolan beside Mark. "What do you want, Thrag?" "To survive." No preamble. No diplomatic framing, just the statement. "My people will integrate into your population. They will live as your kind lives, hidden, ordinary on the surface. They will take partners from among humans. They will produce children." Mark felt the shape of it before Thrag finished. "You're rebuilding the species. I'm ensuring it continues." Thrag looked at him. "In a generation, there will be more of us. In 3 generations, the number becomes significant. Your civilization will never know it's hosting its replacement until the replacement is ready to introduce itself. That's not a peace agreement. That's an occupation with a delay. It is an arrangement that keeps your planet alive today." Thrag's voice didn't shift, didn't argue, just stated flat absolute like a number. "Refuse and I give the order I haven't given yet. 37 fighters across 37 population centers simultaneously. You cannot stop all of them in time. You know this." Mark knew this. "You have an hour to decide. I'll wait." Mark and Nolan pulled back 20 meters close enough to respond fast, far enough for a conversation that wasn't for Thrag's ears. "We can't accept that. We can't refuse it." Nolan's jaw was tight. Not with anger, with the tension of someone running a calculation they didn't like and finding no way to change the output. 37 targets simultaneous, even with Cecil's full roster active, even with Alan, even with... He stopped. We lose too many. So we just let him rebuild. Let him put his people into our families. We buy time. Nolan looked at him. That's what we're doing. We accept today, and we deal with a long problem over time. It's not a good answer. It's a terrible answer. Yes. A pause. It's the one we have. Mark looked at Earth. At the lights just beginning to come visible on the night side city's roads. The accumulated light of 8 billion people who had no idea that their survival had just been traded for a 3-generation clock. He looked at Thrag. Fine, he said. The word came out flat and cost something. We accept. Thrag nodded. One motion. Not triumph satisfaction, the closed-circuit satisfaction of someone whose calculation had produced the predicted result. My people will scatter within 48 hours. You will not be able to track the distribution. Attempting to do so voids the arrangement. I understand. Good. Thrag turned to his forces. Whatever he communicated required no broadcast frequency, a look, a gesture, the compression of command into the smallest possible signal. The 37 began to disperse. It was over. It was not over. And Clark had watched all of it from 30 meters away. He hadn't moved during the exchange, hadn't spoken, hadn't done any of the things that his presence had suggested were possible. The intervention, the disruption, the unilateral decision to resolve this differently. He'd stood in vacuum and watched a deal get made that he had opinions about, and he'd held those opinions in the particular way that a held breath was held, with the awareness that at some point the holding would end. The coalition response team arrived 11 minutes after Thrag's forces began their dispersal. There were 9 of them, high-tier coalition command authority moving in the formation that Mark had seen once before and recognized as asset management rather than combat engagement. They were led by a commander he didn't know, which meant this was official enough to have moved above the level of anyone he'd worked with directly. The commander opened a broad-channel transmission. Unknown combatant. You have operated in coalition-designated space without authorization or oversight for the duration of this engagement. Effective immediately, you are required to submit to identification protocols and accept temporary supervision while your status is assessed. Clark looked at the formation. He looked at Mark. Supervision. Clark? They're calling it supervision. His voice was very level. Surface tension over something with considerable depth beneath it. Last time it was coordination. Before that, containment. He turned back to the commander. You have a word for every version of the same thing. This is standard procedure for... I know what it's standard procedure for. He looked at the command ship behind the formation, a mid-class vessel coalition markings, the communications array on its dorsal hull already live with signal traffic that meant someone was documenting this exchange, in real time building a file establishing the bureaucratic architecture of control before the subject had agreed to be controlled. He hit the communications array. One strike open-handed the force. Calibrated, Mark could see the calibration in it. In it, the deliberate choice of how much, and the array came off the hull in pieces, none of them dangerous, all of them drifting. The ship was undamaged. The crew was unhurt. The signal traffic stopped. The commander's voice, stripped of its broadcast authority, came through on a narrow channel. That was a coalition asset. You'll get a new one. Clark looked at the debris where the array had been. When you decide to come back and try this again, think about what word you want to use. Take your time. He turned away from the formation. None. Mark descended beside him. His arm hurt. Everything hurt. He was running on something past exhaustion that hadn't found its name yet. The depletion that came from surviving things you weren't sure you'd survive, and then having to keep existing afterward. You broke their comm array. Yes. You could have just said no. I did say no. Clark looked at him. That was punctuation. Mark didn't have an answer for that. He looked at the dispersing formation at the command ship, pulling back to a safer distance, at the broader field debris and drifting metal, and the coalition vessels repositioning the whole vast machinery of a war, shutting down its active processes and beginning the slower, more complicated work of accounting for what it had cost. What happens now? Mark asked. For you. Clark looked at Earth, at the Terminator line, creeping across the hemisphere night following day, with the indifference of a thing that had been doing exactly this for 4 billion years and was not going to stop because of what had happened in the last several days in the space above it. I look for a way home. While I'm looking, I stay here. And if something goes wrong with the agreement with Thrag's people, then I handle it. That's not... Mark stopped, started again. Who decides what wrong means? Who decides when you handle something? Clark turned to look at him. The look lasted a moment. I do. Nolan, who had heard the exchange, said nothing. He was looking at Earth the same way he'd been looking at it for the last several minutes, with the expression of someone calculating a future that had more variables in it than futures were supposed to have. Mark looked at Clark, at the armor with the Kryptonian symbol on its chest, at the face that looked approximately his age, and had the eyes of someone who had been carrying something much older than that for a very long time. You're going to be a problem? Clark looked at him. Yes, but so is everything else. He turned toward the planet. Below them, Earth rotated. The cities on the night side burned with light. 8 billion people who had survived a war they'd never been told was happening, who were now sharing their world with 37 sleepers they'd never be able to identify, who were living under the eye of something that had arrived through a hole in space and decided on its own authority that this universe needed watching. Nobody had asked it to stay. It had decided. In the distance, moving away at a pace that suggested deliberateness rather than haste. Thrag's silhouette shrank against the stars until it was indistinguishable from them. The war was over. The accounting was just beginning.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.